Internet, and welcome to my DevOps and Docker show. This is a weekly thing that I do now where I take your questions, we have a little bit of news, and first up, I want you to give me thumbs up in the channel. You can use colon, I think it's thumbs up and colon, or a colon wave colon if you're in chat and my audio looks good, it sounds good, the video looks good. I've got some new software set up this week, and of course, like everything on YouTube, you don't really know if it's going to work well until you go live. So give me a thumbs up or let me know in there how it sounds to you. Been tweaking it all morning, and of course, was doing little changes the very last few minutes before going live. So it's always fun. So get your questions in now. If you didn't know the format of this show, basically I talk a little bit about what's going on. I share some news. If we have guests, we have a little guest stuff. I'll talk more about that in a minute because I got some big stuff coming up there. And then I take your questions, and it can really be anything, but you know, on this show, I'm probably only going to be useful in answering your DevOps, Docker, Kubernetes, cloud, Swarm, all of those sorts of things, sysadmin stuff, managing servers, whatever you want, right? Why is the internet so slow? I don't know. So, you know, why is Facebook down? I don't have any information on that. I can't help you, but I can help you with your Docker questions, especially if you're in my courses. And you can get those over at this little URL here, brettfisher.com/Docker. I have 2 courses. We're finishing up the Node course now, so expect that soon. I keep saying soon, and everyone's like, when is soon? I don't give dates. I just work as fast as I can. The team helps me as much as they can, and we put out good courses. So that's coming soon, and before DockerCon, where we're hopefully going to be able to talk about Node.js courses, right? And I'm going to be doing a talk at DockerCon this year on Docker and Node.js, as well as a Swarm workshop. So hopefully you'll come out. I'll give you a coupon in a minute for that. But for this week, really, there's not a lot of news that I thought was interesting. I do want to share maybe a few newsletters that you might be interested in. There's some stuff. So let's switch over to the browser and just dive into it. Let's just get into the stuff, and then I can get to your questions quicker. All right, hopefully my audio's still good. My green screen's not perfect, so I need to fix that. You get to see my shadow, look at that. There's a shadow there. So interesting stuff playing with things on the internet live. It's kind of fun. Why not? No big deal, it's on the internet forever. It's fine. So today I want to talk about first real quick my website, brettfisher.com. There's a special Docker page there, /Docker. It's got my courses, it's got coupons, it's got a bunch of stuff from past DockerCons, past talks I've done, past workshops, all sorts of utilities and tools that I use with Swarm and Docker and containers in general, and coming up some stuff on Node.js. And if you're a Windows fan, I've talked about this a couple times lately, all the way down at the bottom of this list is a list of my Windows container and .NET stuff for doing .NET and .NET Core in containers. Check that stuff out if you're on Windows. Oh, you gonna try and fix it? On live, we are troubleshooting the screen. It's fine. It's not a big deal. I need to perfect the green screen effect too, because it's not getting the full transparency. All right, so let's look at a couple other things. First off, if you're going to DockerCon, make sure that you find me at DockerCon. Let's do a selfie. I always love doing selfies. There's actually a thing at DockerCon that we call Docker Selfie, and we put it on Twitter. So reach out, say hi. I'd love to chat about what you're doing with containers. And if you have not signed up and you're interested in going to San Francisco in, I don't know, 40 days, I think it is, there is a coupon code. You can use Captain Brett. So coupon code Captain Brett, I think gets you 10% off. Let me put that in chat. Thank you. I don't get anything for that. It's just a way for me to, you know, save you money, right? Because it's not cheap to go to a conference, especially in a city like San Francisco. As cool as San Francisco is, it is an expensive city. So we all need to save a little bit of money when going to these conferences. After that, I want to talk about at this show, right? This is where sort of the Docker captains, these are the community leaders, people that talk Docker all the time in their jobs and in their free time, and they just help everyone. Essentially, that's one of the jobs of a Docker captain. We're not paid to do it. It's just a community. It's kind of like Microsoft MVP. You're awarded this thing. And one of our jobs is just to share as much container info as we possibly can. And starting next week on this show for the next, I think, 6 weeks, going all the way up to DockerCon, I'm going to have a bunch of guests every week, different guests. And they're almost all going to be Docker captains. So luckily, we're working out the schedule on who's going to be on when, but it's going to be great. And we'll have a panel of guests that will be able to talk about stuff and share our container info stories, what we're working on, what we're going to talk about at DockerCon, stuff like that. So definitely show up here next week on Thursdays. Someone did point out that normally I go live at 1 p.m. Eastern US, and because of daylight savings time changing, we are now an hour later. So apologies if you missed this show live, but it will be now at this time for another 6 months, and then when we change back to non-daylight savings time, it'll move back an hour. So that's mostly because I am too silly to remember that I should just change the time of going live. So anyway, check out next week. I've not had a lot of guests on this show, so let me know in chat who you think I should have on, who I should reach out to and try to get on the show. We're going to have people from, startups, from big enterprises, other consultants, and people just that I've reached out to in the industry and that I know, which isn't a whole lot of people. But if you've got good ideas and stretch goals for having some awesome people on this show, I'll be happy to reach out and invite them. So we will do a live Ask Me Anything from DockerCon. So somewhere around May or April 30th through May 2nd, the dates of DockerCon, I'll be doing at least one live show, and we'll have some guests on. That's always fun to do. It also depends on the internet at the conference and how busy that is and whether or not we can get a quality upload, because that's something you really need for a good YouTube live. And let's see, what else? I think that's about it. Yeah, just prepping for DockerCon. I'm doing a talk on Docker for Node.js, which is also the topic of my upcoming course. So I'll be sharing more info on that, including slides around the time of DockerCon. And I think that's it. All right, so this is the time where you get your questions in, and I'm going to go from top to bottom and answer your questions. We can talk about things that maybe you're confused with in your learning, or maybe stuff that you're just having problems with and you're not sure how to fix it. Maybe I can help you with that, or just general topics that you want another opinion on. I don't always have the best opinion or the correct opinion, but I can help. So let's scroll up through the chat to the top. All right. Good morning, everyone. Saying hi to everyone that's saying hi. Let's see. How to set up BuildKit cache. So I think, Alexandra, did you ask this maybe weeks ago, a month ago? I have not messed with the BuildKit cache, although I do expect to have played with that in the next couple of weeks, because I am adding some of that stuff to my Node.js course on how to get the npm cache into your Docker builds. So in case anyone else is not aware, there is a new way to build images in Docker of the latest release, and that is BuildKit. And BuildKit is not on by default. So you need to enable it through an environment variable. On this channel, there's actually a video. If you just search in this channel for BuildKit, you'll find me doing a quick demo of BuildKit. And it's basically a faster and more feature-rich way to build images. And one of the things it can do is it can allow you to add in secrets or volumes or even a cache mechanism while you're building that doesn't end up in the image, which is a brand new thing we didn't really have before. And there are other tools out there that are also adding this in, because we're getting more ways to build images now than just in Docker. But BuildKit is now built into Docker, and all you have to do is enable it through an environment variable, which this blog will talk about. I'll throw this in the chat. And the other thing is that there's a new engineering blog. Yeah. Which Tonus and others are blogging on. So I don't believe that there's anything on that specific issue, but people are posting a lot of stuff. It's actually really good stuff in there. So if you're into the engineering high-end stuff of Docker, like the latest cutting-edge stuff, check out their engineering blog, because stuff like this build kit cache issue will be in there. But if I remember correctly, Alexandra, the problem you were having before was that the cache wasn't working. I think you were trying to get it set up. Just remind me in chat, and I will, yeah, can't remember. But yeah, I haven't played with that yet. But that potentially gives us the ability to save a lot of time in rebuilding our images. So you don't have to do reinstalls of packages and other applications like NPM and apt-get or whatever you have. If you need to do reinstallations and rebuilds, you can essentially use local caches instead of having to wait for everything to download from the internet during your building. All right, next question. Carlos says, to create a swarm, you run this command, docker swarm init, and then advertise address. Is there a way to safely change the advertise address later on? Carlos, as far as I know, no, on that machine. So the advertise address is used for you to allow workers and managers to join, but that's really on that first server. If you need to change, basically, if you're changing the physical machine, then just create a new manager and then get rid of that manager, right? And the IP address for that manager that you added, the new one, will be the one that you can use for others to reach out, right? So it's not like that's the only IP address in your whole swarm that you can use. I don't know of a way to change it on the fly. It's again, these machines are meant to be disposable, so you can just leave the swarm, rejoin the swarm. You can do it that way too. You don't have to completely destroy the machine. But the advertise address is whatever address each node of the managers is listening on for the swarm service on the swarm ports. So you can just add more managers, and there's a different option when you add managers. If you do a join. Yeah, so when you join, anyone can have that, can redo an advertise address. So really, if you had to keep that one machine, I would say leave the swarm and then rejoin it, assuming you have at least 3 managers, right? Because if you have less than 3 managers and that swarm manager leaves, of course, you can always temporarily take a worker and promote it to a manager. And then when you're done, demote that down to a regular worker again. You can use managers, or I'm sorry, you can use workers temporarily to be managers whenever you need to do planned outages. Me personally, if it's a production swarm for a real business making real money, I always have 5 managers. That way I can at least take one down for maintenance, and then it still has the capability to fail another one and still survive, right? Hopefully that helps. Hello, everyone. Thanks for all the heads up on the audio. Great that it's working out today. All right. So Carlos is saying, I have demoted and rejoined using public address instead private address, and mesh networking was broken after that. So I had to kick out all the workers and rejoin them to fix it. I'm not aware of that issue. That sounds like maybe a bug that you should probably file on the Moby repo, because unless that's already a known issue, that should just work. So if you've not done this, just go over to github.com, Moby issues, and you can file a new one with new issue there. Because when I'm doing this on AWS, for example, I will take elastic IPs sometimes and assign those to the managers. That way those IPs don't have to move. If I create a new EC2 instance, I can just reassign that elastic IP and I don't have to go change my scripts. But any of those managers are used as a join IP. So I can technically put an elastic load balancer in front of that, and it just round robin between the three of them if I have just three managers, and any of those would work. But really, I don't want to use the even though that load balancer is easy to do. I don't want that always in the way. I don't want that to always be part of the connection. So I would rather have that join IP, be a real one on a server. So elastic IPs would work. But I've done this before, so I'm not really sure what the difference is between what I'm doing and what you're doing and why it doesn't work. My first guess would be firewall issues, but Carlos, if you're saying that you just simply removed them and rejoined them and it worked, then that definitely sounds like a weird issue. There was an issue in like 2017, maybe even early 2018, where if you had to bring up a swarm from a backup and the IPs were different, that it would not work. And there was sort of hard-coded stuff. But as far as I know, that was all fixed from at least a year ago, at least that I'm aware of. So definitely file a bug. If you want to just ping me in there, I can maybe add some more thoughts. If you have a way to replicate this exact issue on a test server, we can just be able to do this over and over again. That's the best way to get issues fixed in Moby and to get some Docker engineers to actually look at it, is to say, here's a reproducible issue that I expect would work, but it doesn't, and it fails every time. That's a really easy way to get them involved, because there's thousands of open issues, and the hardest part for them is to replicate your problem, and so that they can then start troubleshooting it, right? So check that out. Good question, good discussion on Swarm. All right, scrolling up again in chat. Let's see. Building a Docker image. Hello, Redo. Building a Docker image on a Docker host using user namespace remapping, configuring results and images, not running on Docker hosts other than the one building the image. Looking inside the image, the demo app is missing. Works as designed or bug. Any thoughts about it? So I'm assuming when you say you're doing user namespace remap, are you doing specific IPs or are you using the default settings? I've used user namespace remap before, and so for those, but I've used the default. I've used the Docker defaults. It just manages the names at the high level, right? It starts at like 65,000 or 35,000 or something in the user IDs, and it just counts up from there. And it's been over a year, I think, since I've done that and really paid attention to exactly how it's configuring it. But no, it shouldn't at all affect your images. I would say that's weird that it would make any image different, because the user namespace remapping is about the host, not about the images that you're building, right? Because those are just going to have files in an image. I never have heard of that, so it sounds like yet another bug, or maybe a misconfiguration in the user namespace remapping. Yeah, so if you're using the default, that works all day long. So either you're running it on a system that requires some other special setup. I know that Red Hat machines can often have this sort of thing where you need to mess around with SE Linux to get it working well. And user namespace remapping can have some potential side effects there, I guess. But I do it on Ubuntu and Debian all the time, and it's fine. I have done it on Red Hat in the past, but that was probably 2 years ago, and it just worked out of the box, so I'm not sure what you're seeing. I haven't seen that before myself. So for those of you who don't know, Docker runs all your containers as root by default. And if you want, you can enable user namespace, or we just say user namespaces. But it's a part of the daemon config per server that allows Docker to then run all your containers as a least privileged user. Of course, with all security, there becomes negative side effects. So it sounds like in this case, there's a problem happening on that server or your configuration with rebuilding those images. So that's a weird one. Bala says, any link or session in mastery course for CI/CD with Swarm? So no, there is no CI/CD in Swarm, because, and I actually answered this the other day for someone in chat in the course. CI/CD is a pretty generic process where you have code, you already assume have some sort of CI solution that tests your images, maybe automatically on every Git commit, and then that CI process should now be building your images once tests are successfully run, and then it will push your image to a repo, right, to a registry repository. And then optionally, if you want, for continuous deployment, continuous delivery, depending on which side of that fence you're on, you would just have the same settings in that CI workflow that say, hey, SSH out to my server and deploy the image, do a Docker pull, or if you're on Swarm, you're going to do a service update or a stack deploy, something like that, right? That process is really very generic. It's just change your code, have a webhook that rebuilds your images and pushes them up once the tests are successful, and then optionally have it also SSH into your server and do things. The problem with all of that is that there's 1,000 tools to do it. So it would be hard for me to make one lecture on CI/CD that isn't just that 30-second description, because every CI/CD tool is going to have a different config, it's going to have a different process for setting up your workflows, and then of course every code solution is going to have different ways to test things and stuff like that. But essentially, you just need to wait for tests to be successful, build your image, push it up to a registry, and then optionally SSH in and pull it down into your Docker servers and run it. That's kind of the workflow. Hopefully that helps you get started if you're brand new at it. If you don't have CI/CD, you need that first, right? You need a tool, whether it's Jenkins or just even using Docker Hub, right? You can use Docker Hub to run tests in your images off of GitHub, and inside your Docker file, you would essentially make run commands in your Docker file that run your test on every image build. And that's sort of a easy, cheap, because it's free, at least it's free for open source. It's an easy way to do that, right? You can just build those images. You don't have to have a dedicated CI solution. Now, of course, real CI/CD solutions have a lot more features. They have a better interface. They can do email notifications and stuff like that. But in a pinch, you can just use GitHub and Docker Hub to at least auto-build your images. It won't be able to do CD, automated deployments, but it will at least test and build images. Good question, though. Alexandra is saying, I have issue running yarn install on Dockerfile. So, yeah, I don't know why yarn and long wait time on yarn install. Yeah, so the easiest way to do it is probably, if you can't get the cache working yet, is to try and do some sort of bind mount in the container, which is maybe what you're already doing with the cache setting. But you can do a volume in the container during the build kit build. But that's maybe what you're already trying. So the best thing I have is to suggest is to go into forums.docker.com or into Docker Communities Slack, one of those two places where Docker engineers and more experts hang out, and ask about the question there if you haven't already, or on Stack Overflow, asking for someone. And essentially, again, like other things, put in a replicatable issue. So if you have an open source repo that's doing a yarn install and maybe it takes 60 seconds, then put that in the issue. That way people can try your issue, see if they can make it work, and then give you the fix, rather than just saying something like the worst Stack Overflow question ever. I have this issue and it's not working. Right? The more specifics, the better, so that other people can try to replicate your issue. In fact, if you want to put that up there in an open source repo with an example of describing whether it's in a gist or a paste bin or something, and send it out to me in Twitter or in Slack, I'll take a look at it, because I'm going to have to do that anyway for my course. All right, next question. What's the advantage or disadvantage? This is from Narahari. What's the advantage or disadvantage on taking a base image plus JDK and flattening it? Then take that flattened image plus Tomcat and then flatten it again. What would be the advantage or disadvantage? So image flattening is really to save space if you're doing a bunch of adding and deleting across multiple layers. So that's the only reason I would do that. And if I had some sort of image that once I flatten it, I somehow save lots of time. Sorry, not lots of time, lots of space. And nowadays, with multi-stage builds, which if you have not looked at, definitely take a look at multi-stage builds. Multi-stage builds can help you alleviate some of the potential problems of bloat in your images from multiple lines, adding tar files and then extracting them and then deleting them. If you're doing all that through multiple layers in your image, then you'll end up with a lot of bloat there. And maybe that's why you're flattening. So first thing I would try to do is try to get all of those into a multi-stage build where it's a little more flexible. And so what that does is you would have different stages with different from lines in your Docker file. And the very last stage or the very last part of your Docker file would have a from image that's clean and only has the final output that you need in it. So your resulting image is a lot smaller, a lot leaner. This is also how you can keep out your tests and your other unnecessary tooling from your final image at the very bottom of your Docker file. Hopefully that helps. That's what I would do. All right. Let's see. Cody, any further word on your DCA course? Not to keep bothering, just looking forward to it. Cody, I have no plans for a DCA course yet, no formal plans. I was interested in doing some sort of DCA, whether or not people were interested in some sort of DCA study guide, but I have multiple courses already in the works. And obviously this node.js one, we're working on a plan on a Kubernetes course now. So if I did something on DCA, it would have to either be after that or it'd have to be a really short one that I could do very quickly. So I don't have, because that's going to require, getting Docker Enterprise and teaching people some Docker Enterprise stuff along the way. So I'm glad you're interested in that, but of course we're always trying to go faster, and I'm always trying to make videos more often. So you never know. But I have no formal plans for that yet. I just need to get these other things out of the way, and then we'll have all the time in the world to do a DCA study. But in case you haven't been around a while, for other people on the chat, for people that are taking or planning on taking the Docker Certified Associate test, which is a test on both the Docker open source tools as well as their Docker Enterprise tools, my Docker Mastery course gets you, I would say, 50 to 60% of the way there. And then after you've learned all those open source tools, in order to get ready for that test, you need to go get a 30-day trial or 60-day or whatever, however many days they give it to you, the trial of Docker Enterprise, and then download that and learn how to get through all of the installing and the using of the security tools and the UCP and the DTR and all those different parts of that enterprise tooling. That's what the test is really about. But of course, in order to learn that tooling, all that tooling sits on top of the open source stuff. So you've got to know the open source stuff first. You have to know the Docker command line and Swarm and the local Docker experience of using Docker to deploy images, build images, push them into registries, stuff like that. And then you learn the Docker Enterprise tooling on top of that. So there's I'm aware of, and there's no single course out there that I'm aware of that goes end to end all the way through everything in order to get you ready for DCA. I have seen some DCA study courses, but are really just sample questions. And I haven't taken any of them because I had already taken the DCA and got certified before all that stuff came out. So I haven't taken any of that stuff, don't have any opinions on that. So sorry to be a bummer on that, but yeah, no time soon. All right. Obina, sorry if I mispronounced the name there. Please clarify BuildKit being able to integrate secrets in Docker images during build. Thanks. I would say just look that up on Google. If you just go to, for example, that page I linked into there, introducing BuildKit, he talks about secrets in there, and essentially it gives you options to mount things into your Docker image building that won't be there in the final output, because BuildKit has more features and functionality than the standard building in Docker. So you need to learn BuildKit first, and then once you understand BuildKit and how it's different from the regular builder and how to use it, then you can add the sort of the extra bonus features on top, like using secrets in BuildKit, using caches for your app deployment solutions like NPM and Composer and apps and stuff like that. So I don't have a demo ready for you today to do that, but that's essentially how the secret stuff works. There. It's the long-term solution for how we get things like SSH keys and whatnot into our building stuff, right? because that's been around. That problem has been around a long time. So luckily, I think BuildKit is the best solution for that so far. All right, next question. Can you talk about Docker as a tool? No Swarm, nothing, but for other purposes, experimentation, etc. Well, I mean, Docker is the way I run anything nowadays, right? So if I wanted to run, for example, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking about in terms of experimentation, but if I just wanted to run a Ghost blog or a WordPress blog, I would be using Docker and mostly Docker Compose locally to run that. If there's a more specific question you have on, like you're saying, for other purposes, experimentation, if there's a very specific example you have in mind, give me that in chat, and I can give you more comments on that. But yeah, I don't run Docker on servers, just a one-off very often, because usually if I'm going to run something in a server, I want it to run a long time. I want it to be up, so that's when I'm going to run orchestration. I'll start with Swarm, and if I need something like Kubernetes, I'll consider that, but I usually try to get it running in Swarm because that's easy. And of course, if I'm working with a customer, it's whatever their requirements are, right? So I don't recommend a lot nowadays of people just deploying Docker on servers, a pure Docker engine without something else on top of it that manages the deployment lifecycle of those containers, like Kubernetes and Swarm and ECS and all that stuff. But for local, I don't run any of those orchestrators locally unless I'm just learning them or testing them. Normally locally, if I'm running things, for example, today I was running something in node.js called Strappy, which is an API builder, and it presents you a web interface that allows you to add API endpoints in the web interface. And I was just running that through Docker, and I built a Docker file, and you can see here that I'm doing stuff, and I run Docker Compose to just get that stuff running, and then I do the rest of what I need to do in the browser. So if that's what you're talking about, yeah, I do that all the time. All right, next question. Daruv, hopefully I said that correctly. Can you talk about using Docker for GUI apps like Firefox? Let's see. GUI apps in Docker mean you need to use X11. So Docker by default doesn't have any access to a monitor or to the video output of a traditional computer, right? And if you're on Mac and Windows, you're essentially running in a VM. So that VM is terminal only, doesn't really expose video drivers or anything like that. So if you're wanting to run something in Docker that has a GUI, one of two options exist. Either you do something in that container that then allows you to use a web browser to remote into that. So for, what I mean here is there's a tool. Let me go to Docker Hub. There's some examples where people have taken full Linux distros and made, let me see, where am I? I don't know how to see my favorites anymore. Yeah, these are just mine. They've changed the Docker interface, and I don't really think I've ever had to go look at my favorites. Let's see. See if I have one here. Nope. I'm trying to think what was the Linux distro that I just saw the other day. So there's a Medium article that I was reading the other day. But essentially, let's see if he has a good diagram here of what's got to happen. No, he doesn't. All right. This doesn't really help that much. But essentially, you have to run an X11 server. And X11 gives you a network port so that you can have stuff running in your container that then talks out through a server, and then you use an X11 client. It's not the same way, unless you're on a pure Linux system. It's not going to be the same experience. The GUI is not going to look as nice. It's not going to have all the same functionality as a regular desktop app on Mac and Windows. So most people don't do it, and it's too much work and it's not enough benefit. But if you're already running a dedicated Linux desktop, if you're on Ubuntu or Mint or something else like that, then you can experiment with trying to get all your stuff into containers, and because they're already using some sort of X11, usually that's already built into the OS and it's there for your use. So it might be a little bit better experience that way. I don't know of anyone that does that full time. I know Jesse Frizzell has some great stuff on the internet that you probably, if you just search on Docker GUIs, you will certainly find Jesse's videos and blog stuff about that. She was one of the very earliest people to get that working. But I don't see that happening a lot, other than just for experimentation, because it's just not as good of an experience when using X11. Hopefully that helps. And you also asked, are you looking for co-trainers, instructors for the courses you're making? I'd love to contribute and learn and pair with you and make a course. I am not right now. I don't plan on doing any co-instructors inside my videos, but I will keep that in mind. Thank you. Dragoon says, how do you handle persistent data on Docker Swarm, because sometimes the app will be on a different node? So the answer to that, the first answer I'll give you is RexRay. That's a great question. So if you go to rexray.io, RexRay is essentially a storage orchestrator, and it acts as a plugin in Docker and will mount the shared storage that you have off the server somewhere to the correct node when a container starts up on that node. And you can see an example of that in my dog versus cat repo. So I will send you the Swarm plus RexRay stuff. And you can go check that out. So in there, what I use as an example is I'm using DigitalOcean's block storage as a back end for all my databases and persistent storage stuff in a Swarm on multiple apps. And then RexRay's job is to go provision that storage with the cloud provider and then connect it to the correct node when it's needed. And it works, all right? And it's not necessarily its own file storage system. It simply is connecting your existing storage to your machine, whichever node that is. If you need something like data replication between nodes, there are other solutions for that, like Portworx and Ceph, and you can probably just look around for Docker storage replication, and you can find some different options out there to do that. And then some of those will work with Swarm. Basically, you just Google whatever you're looking for with Swarm and see if they have a Swarm solution. And to work with Swarm, they really just need to have a Docker plugin, which is like a Docker driver for volumes that allows it to connect and do whatever you need to do for that storage. And of course, every storage is different, so you would need a different driver or a different plugin for that. Good question. All right. What are uses of Docker other than Swarm, like installing Ansible inside container and using from the host? Yeah, so you could definitely use Docker as a general utility runner. In fact, Whale Brew, I think, yeah. There was an experiment a couple of years ago called Whale Brew. This is probably, oh, look at that. He's got last commit 10 days ago. It's still maintained. So one of the Docker engineers made this utility that's kind of like Max Brew. You know, on a Mac OS, you can use a utility called Brew to install a bunch of Linux utilities, or Unix utilities really, on your machine. And it's a really great way to get command line stuff, and also GUIs if you use the Brew cask stuff. And so you can kind of do that same thing with Docker, where everything will run in the container. And usually, though, you would have to do like Docker run and then a volume, add in a couple of volumes there, whatever you needed, and a bunch of other stuff. So what Whale Brew does is it will find the official images that you would want to use for that tool, and then it will make all the nice little extras like mapping volumes and stuff like that. It'll put all that in, I think it's just basically in shell scripts. I'm not exactly sure how it does it, but it makes it easy to run this stuff. And instead of you running native tools, you would be running that stuff in a container. And it's a pretty interesting experiment. I haven't used it since it first came out because I did not honestly think that it was going to be maintained. It was just sort of a proof of concept, but it looks like he's got at least a commit in the last couple of weeks. So he's got a great example here on how, for example, to use the AWS CLI without having to install the AWS CLI on your machine. One of the benefits here is that you could be using it on any machine, not just a Mac or whatever you had the AWS CLI on. So you can definitely check that out. That's an interesting experiment on how you just do everyday utilities inside of Docker. I do sometimes do tools inside of Docker that I wouldn't be able to get otherwise on my Mac, and a good one there is under my Docker Hub account. I have one called, let's see. Well, first there's NetShoot. Let's talk about that for a second. That's really cool. And then another one is HTTPing. So HTTPing is a tool that combines curl and ping into a single command that does HTTP gets against a web server, but it acts like the ping command where it just keeps doing it over and over. And that tool is available on some Linux distributions like Debian in an apt package, but it's not always available. It's not available by default on Alpine. It's not on Windows. So I just put that single utility in a container image, and then I show examples of just how to run that from the command line. And of course, you could always make a bash alias, right? You could always make a command line alias in PowerShell, and then run this command as a quick little easy one-liner without having to do everything I do here, where you can see I have a bunch of options that I have to specify. So you can check that out. That's one way to do it. The other neat utility that I do from the command line, I stole this idea from another Docker engineer, and it's called NetShoot. It's from Nicola, and Nicola has his own repo. You should probably go check that one out. Just search Docker NetShoot or Kubernetes NetShoot, and it's a whole bunch of Linux utilities that are designed around network troubleshooting in orchestration and in containers in general. Because even if you have just one container host, you've got all those virtual networks in there, and you've got a lot of stuff going over the network that can get screwed up. You can have IP table problems. You can have other network problems. And so a lot of the utilities in here are just generic, regular old Linux tools. But he puts them all in, and he has graphs that don't show up very well on the Docker website. But a lot of information in there, and his repo is well maintained. I just keep a copy of it, so you should probably go check out his repo. I'll actually throw the original one in there. I throw a couple of my own utilities in there. That's why I keep my own. But you can definitely check out NetShoot. That is probably the most complicated and feature-rich example of a bunch of different tools all in one container image that are just meant to run on whatever system you want to run them on. So there you go. Whole lot of options for you. Giving a Docker image to another person and say, run this, and you should have the tool you want. Things like that. Yeah, that's perfect. That's exactly what this stuff is for, is to say, hey, you want to run this tool the same way I'm running it? Let me just put it in a Docker image. And in fact, one of the lesser used Docker commands you can do for that is the Docker commit. So you can, in Docker, if you have a container and you did some stuff in that container, maybe you installed some tools, and maybe you didn't make a Docker file because this is just a quick thing you wanted to do, you can do a Docker commit. And what the Docker commit does is it takes a running container or a stopped container, and it will make an image out of that. And then you could push that image up or export that image. You can do a save to actually put it on a USB stick if you wanted to. And then you can give that to someone else and have them run it, right? So that's one way to troubleshoot also. If you have something that's problematic in production, you can do a Docker commit and save it and its stuff into an image. There's another command that's very, it's not talked about a lot, but it's very handy in those troubleshooting situations. And let me find it for you. Docker checkpoint. So if you look at Docker checkpoint, and this doesn't work in all situations. I don't think it works in Swarm either. But check it out. So what this does is this essentially freezes the container and memory and saves it so that you can then restore the whole thing later. If you're into troubleshooting and debugging stuff, this is super cool. I had not really used it other than just to play with it and see that it works, but I haven't used it in sort of some awesome production scenario where I say, I debugged that off server without affecting the production server. But that's kind of what this stuff is meant for, is for you to do that sort of thing. And I've talked to others that have done it. I just haven't done it myself in a real world scenario. So check those out. That was exactly some of the benefits of Docker, is being able to take what you have, give it to someone else, and have them run it exactly the same way you were running it. That's kind of one of the original ideas of what Docker was meant to do. So, all right. So this is the time in where we sort of wind down. If you have any more last questions, get those in, and I will answer those. Recommend Whale Brew, Cody says, because it becomes an app in user local bin for Mac OS. Oh, okay. So it does the same thing as Homebrew. Yeah, that's really cool. And Arpit says, how do you run cron jobs in Docker Swarms to access other containers and run some functionality periodically? Yeah, so a quick example, that's a common question, is to check out my, let's see, dog versus cat repo. In my dog versus cat repo, which the link is up higher in chat, I have a couple of very simple examples in there, okay, on just running something on occasion like a swarm image prune. So if I just show you this example, this is creating a service that does a bash for loop, and it basically sleeps a day, and then it runs a Docker command on the host. Even though it's in the container, it'll connect to the Docker socket on that host and then run a command from the host to clean up images. Another simple example, again, these are simple examples, not full job engines. But if I needed a database backup, I could simply do something, let's see, Docker, let's see, stack ghost. And in stack ghost, this is basically a ghost website. If I needed to do a database backup every day, actually, I think this one does it every hour. Yeah, it sleeps 3,600 seconds. And this is, again, another bash while true loop that essentially every hour will run a MySQL dump over the network. And so you can see it's a service. It attaches to the same networks as the services that it needs to back up. It'll talk to that MySQL server, do a network-based MySQL dump, back it up into a special volume that's connected off disk in a separate block storage system that is not related to production, so that I won't accidentally mix them up, right? And that way I have backups every hour, and then it will automatically get the password using secrets, and it does a couple other neat little things there, auto dating using a bash shell script. So those are simple examples. If you want to get into more complex scenarios, there is a list. Let me see if I can find that for you, because this is a really great topic that a lot of people are looking to do. The last one that I saw was this one. Let me bring up a couple for you. Jobs. So I would say follow this issue. If you're interested in jobs and cron and swarm, this one has a lot of links of different options. In fact, I think a while back I listed a bunch of them in this issue. So definitely check out this issue on swarm jobs. The most recent example was someone creating this simple little cron job scheduler that acts as a swarm service, so you can check that one out. That's a link inside that same. So really, just everything was be in that GitHub Moby issue. But here's another one, and there are other more complicated examples, more full-featured systems that do stuff as well in that list. We don't have one clear winner that everyone uses, and it's not yet a feature out of the box in Swarm, even though we have all asked the Docker team to make that a full a top feature, kind of like you have in Kubernetes, where you can just have jobs right out of the box. And it would be nice to have that in Swarm as well. And of course, it's always open source. It's all open source, so you can always do your own. If you're a Go programmer, you can obviously start talking about that with the Docker team and add that to Swarm potentially. But for the rest of us that are not awesome Go programmers, we just kind of have to wait on someone to do that. All right. Last up. Let's see. Oh, I'm sure you've talked about Swarm versus Kube and hashed it to the best for the mortals. Is Kube a fad, or do you think it has traction? Why the negative publicity around Swarm? You talk highly of it, but why is it the negative perception? So Kubernetes will take over the world, in my opinion, but still the Docker EE subscribers, most of about 80% use Swarm. Docker Swarm, ease of use, Kubernetes much more advanced. That is a great summary and a one-liner, Cody. So there's a lot of reasons, right? We could go through all the reasons. I would say that the internet loves to hype things, right? Docker was not immune to this 5 years ago. Docker was extremely hyped, more than what it probably should have been. I was probably part of that because it was hard to get working properly in a lot of cases early on, but everyone was talking about it, right? Nowadays, we have ways that you can run containers without even using Docker, technically. Other tooling, other things like Containerd, stuff that you don't need Docker out of the box to even run Docker. So that's the normal path I think we see in a lot of leading edge tech. Cloud was the same way. When cloud first came out, all the people that were into the latest thing were really all about the cloud. And then here we are over a decade later, and there's still companies that are not fully using the cloud. They're not completely in the cloud. We now talk about hybrid. And if you think about it, even with the cloud tech, even if you go far as back as virtualization, every one of these new patterns for infrastructure goes through this sort of creation, hype, and then into a sort of the valley of reality, which is not everyone can use the same tool. There is no healthy part of the ecosystem where we all use the same tool, right? Even those that were convinced that VMware was the only virtualization tool around, there was lots of other options besides VMware. I was in a shop where we were using Microsoft Hyper-V on over 300 servers, and it was great. But if you went to a conference, everyone was talking VMware, VMware, VMware. I think the same thing largely exists around all the new tools today, right? A lot of us assume Docker, but there are people now not using Docker at all, even though they're running containers. There's people now, they're using Red Hat, and Red Hat's saying in the next version of Red Hat 8, they're not even going to have the Docker command line. It's only going to be their tools. So this is all sort of a standard thing. Kubernetes for the near future is not the best scenario when you only need 3 servers, or you're just wanting to run it on some Raspberry Pis. There's a lot of work being done in Kubernetes to make it easier and a smaller footprint. There's something out now called K3s, which is a small, tiny version of Kubernetes. That's a pretty cool experiment, but it's very early days and it's just an experiment. So in a lot of those cases where you only need a few servers, or you're running on IoT devices or small little ARM machines, that Kubernetes is simply just too much complexity, too much work. And quite frankly, my attitude is, because I know both, is to use Swarm as much as possible because it has the least amount of administrative overhead. And then if I need the complexity and the advanced functionality of Kubernetes, then do that, right? We don't all need to use trucks every day to get around town. A lot of us can just use regular cars. I think Steve Jobs back in the day used that analogy. And then some people will need trucks because they need more advanced car functionality. Right? So I think Kubernetes is that, right? All the infrastructure players are doing Kubernetes because it is the most popular, but also because it is hard to get right. It's hard out of the box to make a secure, highly redundant, and fault-tolerant Kubernetes system in all cases, right? But Swarm out of the box is just a couple of commands, and it's automatically default to secure. And if you just add 3 servers as managers, then it's automatically redundant. So it's a lot easier to get started. It's a lot easier to understand. And I think that's the real advantage to Swarm. If Swarm wasn't easy to use, I wouldn't see a need for it because Kubernetes obviously solves all the other problems that Swarm sometimes doesn't solve. Now, that being said, they're both merging, right? Swarm is getting more functionality. I think we're hopefully going to hear some new features at DockerCon. I don't have any actual hard evidence on that, but I do know that the Swarm team this year went off-site and talked about orchestration and what are they going to do to help Swarm and Kubernetes in the Docker command line. We saw earlier this month, by the way, Swarm, let's see, Docker released a new open source repo for stacks on Swarm. And let's see, let's call this Docker Stack. Yeah, Docker Stacks. So this is a new open source repo that gives you a Stacks API on top of Swarm. And it runs as a container right now, but I'm kind of hoping that Docker will bundle this into the SwarmKit API, and then we'll have a full feature Stacks API. And that'll give us some of the missing pieces out of Swarm that we get out of Kubernetes, because Kubernetes is entirely an API. It's API driven. And with Docker Swarm right now, the Stacks stuff is command line only. It's actually in the CLI. It's not really a server-side functionality. So they're definitely merging, right? We've got Swarm adding more and more functionality, but maintaining its ease of use. We got Kubernetes that's really complicated, but getting easier to use. We're getting better tooling, and it's not. I don't know that it's getting a smaller memory footprint yet, because it's still pretty memory and CPU intensive. But maybe we'll see that as well. And all these tools will eventually, it'll be hard to distinguish. between them. And they'll all have the major functionality we all need, as long as Docker keeps supporting Swarm, because they're the major open source contributor to the Swarm project. So, but Docker for years now has been saying, we're sticking with Swarm. We're going to keep offering Swarm. Lots of companies like Swarm. They like choice. And quite frankly, not one size fits all, right? Not everyone can use Swarm. Not everyone can use Kubernetes. The thing about Kubernetes in the ecosystem, though, is that it has a larger community, and so it has a lot more stuff going on. And what does that? That means that you can talk about it more. So that means more podcasts. That means more news outlets have something to share every week about Kubernetes because there's a new project. So that tends on the internet to make it sound like Kubernetes is bigger than it really is. In other words, it makes it sound like 99% of people are using Kubernetes, and that's simply not true. There are a lot of Kubernetes versus Swarm analysis out there, and I'll actually just show you a couple of them. Because I'm passionate about this mostly because I feel like sometimes we get on the internet and we think the internet's telling us we have to do a thing. And then I tell you that's not true in any case. Like, there's no have-tos on the internet, right? We don't all have to microservice. There's lots of people doing large apps and being very successful at that instead of doing microservices. There's so many trends on the internet that it can be confusing to think that you would do something different than everyone else. Let's see. So, okay. So there are some Swarm usage statistics. So if you go, for example, on sysdig, and this is from last year, and we look on Swarm, we'll see that Docker usage and Kubernetes usage is both increasing. So Swarm and Kubernetes, we're getting more people using them. And Swarm, in fact, I think in this study, so larger clusters, people were choosing to do Kubernetes, but on smaller clusters, people were choosing Swarm because it's easier to use, right? So the key there is there increased usage in a tool? Because if there is decreasing usage in a tool and it's steady decreasing over time, that's when I get concerned about a tool. If I see increased usage in a tool over time overall in the marketplace, and the user base is increasing, then I feel like that tool has a future as long as it still has, the maintainers and the backers on that project. If you see over on DigitalOcean, they did one last year. They did a survey where they found that Swarm was increasing in usage as well as Kubernetes, and that Swarm was, Swarm is 35% of usage on their platform, and Kubernetes was 42%. So it's really about the audience that you're in. And who is on DigitalOcean, right? Traditionally on DigitalOcean, smaller teams with less complexity are on that cloud hoster, right? On AWS, you have the biggest players in the industry, the most complex infrastructure. So you would expect to see more Kubernetes usage on that platform versus a simpler infrastructure that's ideal for smaller teams and solo developers, right? Then you go over to the CNCF survey, and even they showed increased usage of Swarm as well as Kubernetes, right? So you can look at their statistics and show that Swarm's increasing its usage over time up to 20%. And this is with the CNCF. And if you think of the CNCF audience, their biggest project is Kubernetes. They are primarily a Kubernetes audience. But inside there's still lots of other orchestration tooling being used. Mesos, Cloud Foundry, OpenStack, which is technically a Kubernetes variant. But these tools are all being used. Now, the trends is what I look at. So you see Cloud Foundry's usage with CNCF is decreasing. You see Mesos's usage decreasing. So that's the trends that I really care about. Lastly, there was one last year from a company. I think this is from F5. So F5 is a load balancing company, and they are probably very much more enterprise and large team focused. And what's interesting is that they found a high usage of Swarm, higher than Kubernetes, which was interesting because it probably indicates that it's easier to get started with Swarm and that Kubernetes takes more time, and that these larger enterprises need more time and they need to learn as they go, which is why I always tell people the order of learning is learn Docker, learn Swarm, and then learn Kubernetes, because you try to go to Kubernetes first, you're not going to understand the underlyings of it. If you try to use Kubernetes before Swarm, then you may not realize that you could get away with using Swarm without ever needing Kubernetes. So I don't say that there's any good or bad tools. It's really just choice, and it just depends on what you need. And I would say that and if there's anything I'm trying to communicate, it's that let's look at evidence, and let's look at multiple points of evidence, and let's look at trends rather than popular headlines and hype on things like Reddit and, other places. So great question. I get it often, and every time I get it, I have a little bit different take on it, and I'm glad to answer it. So thanks a lot for joining my show. Thanks a lot. I see you at the end there, Alexandra, talking about rebuilding HTTP ping. I will recheck that to make sure that works. If you have not been on this show before, thanks for sticking to the end. I will be here again next week with guests. We're hoping to have Docker captains on every week from now until DockerCon, which is a little more than a month away. So show back up here around the same time next week. Like and subscribe, or what is it? Subscribe and click the bell, and you get notified when I go live in the future. And I will see you next week on the internet.